This is a video which in its entirety attempts something rather ambitious to reflect the key geopolitical challenges faced in our world as we approach the American midterm elections of 2022. I claim no omniscient expert status beyond a seasoned therapist's capacity to discern motivation trends and character styles. And even this is hardly infallible with individuals, and still less so when it comes to the psychological makeup of governments and nations. If there's anything distinctive about my perspective, perhaps it's that I'll be speaking from the seldom visited intersection where politics, evolutionary psychology / spirituality, myth, and technology meet. Such a view may prove useful for a cultural epoch so divided that it now requires the joining of those focused on political activism and those focused on spiritual transformation. We'll begin with a thread running through several of this video's takes, which is the impact of advanced semiconductor chips, as this plays out in China, Russia, and in the U.S. And this first segment will also begin to evoke the impact of the hubristic narcissism, psychopathy, and autocracies as these psychological tendencies motivate the governance of these three nations. So, let's get started. There's an island where the South and East China Seas meet. Should you Google it, you might learn that most of this island's traditional places of worship combine elements of Buddhism, Taoism, and folk religions. Yet, I'm writing about Taiwan because it has something that neither China nor Russia has, and that both of them need. And I'm not referring to an abundance of Buddhist masters or Taoist sages, however helpful that could only be. Instead, Taiwan possesses the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment in the world, and it is vital for advanced military weapons systems. The leaders of mainland China say that Taiwan belongs to them, in the same way that Putin says Ukraine belongs to him, in the same way Trump says the presidency and its classified documents belong to him. This arrogant sense of entitlement and its willingness to violate proper bounds and proportions in order to get or maintain power was termed hubris by the ancient Greeks. They viewed it as both a civic crime against other people as well as a violation of archetypal relations, a crime against the gods. Nearly all the protagonists in ancient Greek tragedies were brought down by their hubris, for it was believed to give rise to a countering force, Nemesis, who punishes those who'd succumb to hubris, though today other terms have been used to account for such behavior: narcissism, psychopathy, autocracies. Someone who likely knows as much as anybody about semiconductor chips and their relevance to geopolitics is Sujay Shivakumar. He's the director and senior fellow of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. On June 22, 2022, he published a revelatory paper that deserves a wider readership. In it, he writes, "Ensuring U.S. leadership in semiconductor technologies and securing the integrity of the value chains that design, manufacture, package, and distribute these chips are perhaps the preeminent economic and national security concerns of the modern era." And that, regardless of one's political leanings, seems not a small thing to say, though it overlooks climate change, which I'll speak about later. Shiva Kumar tracks the pivotal importance of semiconductor chips as far back as the mid-1980s, when President Reagan articulated the need to retain U.S. global leadership in chips to counter the Soviet bloc's numerically superior military forces through smart systems driven by semiconductors. Yet in China today, the U.S. faces an even greater challenge. It is confronted by a geopolitical rival that is stronger economically and technologically than the Soviet Union ever was. At the same time, the United States is struggling to halt and reverse the loss of its leading capacities in manufacturing microelectronics. For though the U.S. remains the leader of semiconductor design, American-based chip manufacturing has declined to around 10% of the world total and lacks the onshore capacity to make the most advanced devices at the 7 and 5 nanometer nodes. U.S. firms depend on sources in Taiwan and South Korea for the production of its most advanced chips. Yet the offshoring of elements of the U.S. semiconductor production chain heightens national security risks. They include the potential for intellectual property theft, the introduction of counterfeit devices, plus the disruption of chip supply chain by natural disasters, geopolitical conflicts, and pandemics. These national security risks would become heightened should an adversary gain long-term dominance in semiconductors or block a nation's access to the most advanced chips. These chips are already vital in many tools of warfare and are essential in the application of artificial intelligence, or AI, which is expected to further revolutionize warfare and technology in general. For here's the thing, AI enables computer systems to problem solve and address tasks at speeds that vastly outpace humans. And not only is AI faster, it doesn't get fatigued, forget, or suffer from emotional fluctuation. In a future war, as U.S. Senator Mike Rounds, Republican from South Dakota, put it, defending against AI-capable adversaries operating at machine speeds without employing AI ourselves is an invitation to disaster. China, at present, remains 2 or 3 generations behind the U.S. in its semiconductor technology, while the U.S. is dependent on facilities located in Taiwan for production of the most advanced cutting-edge AI-enabling semiconductors. And from a national security perspective, Shiva Kumar finds this precarious in that the vast majority of these chips are produced at a single plant, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which lies just 110 miles of water from China. Resultingly, the U.S. has induced TSMC to begin building a fab in Arizona, which will operate at the 5 nm node beginning around 2024, though by that time it is thought that state-of-the-art is likely to have moved to 3 nm chips, all of which will be made in Taiwan. So however you slice it, a ravenous Chinese wolf will view Taiwan as a temptingly close lamb chop on the hoof. Meanwhile, Russia's need to resupply its military weaponry due to losses in Ukraine has left it so deficient in semiconductor chips that it has been forced to turn to Iran for drones and to repurpose chips from consumer electronics for its weaponry. Autopsies of Russian drones reveal almost all have imported electronic components scrounged from consumer products made by Sony, Nintendo, and Samsung. However, these repurposed chips are not adequate for the most advanced weaponry, such as those needed for the newer jet fighters and for precise, long-range missile defense systems. The very weaponry the U.S. has been reluctant to provide to Ukraine during the early months of the current war with Russia, as well extending far backwards into time. And so, while Russia continues to launch predominantly imprecise, long-range missiles at Ukraine from Russian soil, and violates Ukrainian airspace, inflicting indiscriminate damage below, the battlefield has, until very recently, been tilted in Russia's favor, and this has been a constant faced by Ukraine for many years, and once led a highly placed Ukrainian official to say of the U.S., "You won't let us drown, but you won't let us swim." The costs of war are many. Thus, military strategists must include the calculation of what it will take to make the cost so prohibitive that the enemy will stop fighting. And as of July 20, 2022, the CIA estimated that the Russians had suffered the deaths of at least 15,000 troops and likely 3 times that many casualties. While the UK's Armed Forces Minister had 2 months earlier estimated more than 20,000 Russian military personnel have died in the war. And after the first month of the war, the Kremlin has been reluctant to provide any figures of its own. But no matter the number of Russian deaths on Ukrainian soil, they haven't been enough to dissuade Putin, though it has required the Russian government to offer radical bonuses to attract recruits, including those who are in prison. For Putin had been, for the first 7 months of the war, understandably reluctant to introduce a draft. It would be domestically unpopular and reveal the lie that his war in Ukraine was nothing more than a military exercise. And so, neither the deaths of Russian soldiers nor the financial costs of war have stopped Putin's onslaught. And the extent remains uncertain whether the partial sanctions the EU placed on Russian gas and oil exports in June will force Russian petroleum off the market, or if it will simply be redirected to other markets. In truth, as the cost of petroleum-based imports by other countries have skyrocketed, Russia has not been dealt the kind of massive economic injury that could lead it to negotiate for an end of hostilities. In fact, during the first 4 months of 2022, Russian oil export revenues rose by 50% over the previous year. For while Russia is not receiving any incoming missiles from Ukraine, it is receiving an estimated $1 billion each day from gas and oil exports. And as the war extends into the winter of 22-23, Russia will have Europe even more over a barrel filled with Russian gas that Europe will need to keep itself warm. And this could challenge the continuity of Europe's united front against Russia. So don't for a minute buy into the belief that Putin isn't a rational actor. He is a psychopath as well as a narcissist, for he's displayed to a staggering degree the lack of empathy so central to both. But Putin is as rational and calculating as a fox stealing chickens. and to see his rational and calculating nature in greater relief, as well as to better understand the current tensions between China and the U.S. over Taiwan, we should consider reportage outlined by Dale C. Copeland in his article, When Trade Leads to War, published in Foreign Affairs on August the 23rd, 2022. Copeland shows us that much more so than the United States, both Russia and China rely to an enormous degree upon trade with other nations for economic growth and to ensure its position on the world stage. A majority of Russia's governmental income derives from the export of its oil and gas, while the enormous growth of China's GPD over the past 2 decades has largely come from the export of its manufactured products, as China has become the workshop to the world, and conventional thinking must thus assume that maintaining these trade relations would place a deterrent against military conflict for both countries. Yet Copeland points out that economic ties often play out in ways that defy expectations. For those who assume that commerce can help prevent great power conflict, it is critical to examine the complex ways that economic forces have actually shaped strategic thinking in both Beijing and Moscow. Regarding the former, China's leadership knows that in its international relations it needs to strike a delicate balance, having to craft a foreign policy that is moderate enough to sustain the basic trust that allows economic trade to continue, while on the other hand, China needs to project enough military power to deter others from threatening those ties. The latter helps explain China's saber-rattling towards the U.S. over Taiwan, which China depends upon for semiconductor chips, while with Russia, the expression of military power towards Ukraine also had an economic basis, though there are 2 aspects of that seldom referenced in recent reportage, and Copeland highlights both of them in his article. First, that Europeans continue to buy Russian gas at high levels even after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. This, writes Copeland, suggested strongly to Putin that the same would be true if he invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. And though Putin underestimated both the strength of the united response by the EU and the US, as well as the strength of Ukraine's military to withstand a quick takeover of their country, he was correct in calculating that Europe was more dependent on his natural gas than Putin was dependent on the EU for its sale. For even the sanctions placed against Russian exports didn't severely cripple Russia's economy as much as the West had expected. Since the start of the war, the American stock market has tanked at least as much, while the price Russia could charge for its petroleum exports actually increased. Plus, there are other nations throughout Africa and Asia, India for one, who weren't allied with the sanctions of the U.S. and the EU, and who were only too happy to purchase what Russia offered, especially at discounted rates. But also significantly, in 2010, huge natural gas deposits were discovered south of the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv and extending into the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. This was an enormous field, enough to provide the total consumption of the EU's 27 countries for years to come. The Ukrainian government then signed agreements with ExxonMobil and Shell to work together on deep water extraction off the southeast coast of Ukraine. This could have hardly passed unnoticed in Moscow, for should Ukraine succeed in exporting its own gas to the EU, Ukraine would threaten Putin in multiple ways. Ukraine would become an ever more self-sufficient and viable liberal democracy, one with even stronger economic ties to Europe. It would also offer a visible, successful, and radically different alternative to neighboring Russians. For if the Ukrainians could also have the freedom to really choose its own leaders, then why couldn't Russia do the same? Yet further, Russia would be faced with the loss of the economic leverage it had held over both the EU and Ukraine. This feared loss of economic leverage thus contributed to Putin's sense that it was now or never to absorb most of the Ukraine east of the Dnieper River, the area containing over 90% of Ukraine's natural gas reserves. The U.S. economy is far more multifaceted and independent than either Russia or China. Yet we live in an interdependent global world, one where Biden finds himself more under attack in his own country than has Putin in his for the economic costs of the war in Ukraine. For given the inherent differences between a constitutional democracy and an autocracy, Putin has no opposition party to hold him accountable for the costs of an unnecessary war. And the same would hold true in China. And if you just exchange the word Russia for the word America, you could file Putin's motivation for going to war against Ukraine under the same slogan as Trump's "Make America Great Again," with both Putin and Trump imagining themselves as their cause's triumphant, messianic redeemer. And while Biden shouldn't be blamed for a worldwide inflation and the economic pain the war has caused Americans to experience at the gas pump, this is already the war cry of the Republican Party, an outraged cry against Biden and his party, inflation bringers, that will continue to be echoed as we stumble closer to the midterm elections of 2022. For the Republican Party has been desperate to deflect attention from the revelations of the January 6 hearings, which haven't even appeared on Fox News. The pain Americans feel at the gas pump and in the increased cost of almost everything provides the GOP with a welcome and assumptive whipping boy. But really, thinking Biden is powerful enough to be blamed for the world's inflation? He barely moves the needle on the charisma scale. He's not narcissistic enough. And what would the Trump-centric Republican foreign policy alternative have been? To sell out U.S. support of Ukraine and America's European allies while currying favor with Putin? And so, while polling poorly and lacking an overwhelming mandate to lead, the lesser mandate that elected Putin was not to be Trump and help restore a sense of normalcy. Any moderately sane, less autocratic leader could have succeeded in the first part of that lesser mandate. Yet Biden has also succeeded in galvanizing, finally, 2/3 of his nation to become inoculated against a pandemic that won't go away even then. And he has done nearly all that could be asked of him in helping to form a near worldwide coalition to oppose Putin's invasion of Ukraine, an invasion that Biden's predecessor in the White House had admiringly congratulated as an act of genius. But the second part of Biden's lesser mandate restoring a sense of normalcy has been a mission impossible. For these are not normal times. A nation still divided about who really won the 2020 election remains too much in denial to take on a yet more overwhelming threat as the one planet we have heats up, burning and flooding and fast approaching a point of no return. And so, at times, Biden has seemed overwhelmed and unable to act more decisively in a dark night of America's soul, where he seemed like a deer frozen by the glare of a twin set of contending headlights, America's two warring political parties, plus the struggle between the progressive and mainstream parts of his own party. But today, as we near the midterm elections, you could say the same for any political candidate in the country. Biden had hoped to unify the nation, like Obama before him, but it would be hard for even Jesus or an Abraham Lincoln to be up to that task at a time that the nation is more divided than any time since Lincoln. For all their prayers sent to the families of slain children in classroom, the MAGA wing of the Republican Party might condemn Jesus for being a socialist giving free lunches to the poor of the same ilk as Bernie Sanders. Even the Christian nationalists would have a problem with a long-haired Jew speaking in parables. And the current Supreme Court would have to come to some curious ways of interpreting the fact that Jesus wasn't even born here. Remember all the birther hoo-ha about where Obama was born? And besides, in this polarized secular age, I see no Messiah waiting in the wings to unify or save us from ourselves. Geopolitically, Biden initially dropped the wobbly ball, the intensified sanctions that were passed to him from Trump in dealing with Iran. While he was correct to recognize that China is a threat, the one we'll need to learn how to live with, and find areas where we can work together, such as in addressing climate change, for the Chinese, in the end, are pragmatic people. And more so than the U.S., with our 2- and 4-year election cycles and our penchant for political amnesia, the Chinese are a patient nation with a long-remembered historical past that leaves it more attuned to playing the long game, and likely thus at present a less menacing foe than Russia. But unfortunately, America's now politicized Supreme Court has sought to apply limits to legislation and governmental agencies established to protect the environment. They have already been, and likely will continue to be, opposed by the court on allegedly constitutional grounds in order to protect against what is viewed as an overreaching federal state, not dissimilar to the deep state decried against by Trumpism. In other words, America's already delayed response to global warming will now have to contend with the Supreme Court, who will find no original 18th century judicial precedents for 21st century problems, such as global warming or AR-15 assault rifles. And though the Supreme Court's striking down of Roe v. Wade seemed the victory conservative Republicans had conspired to achieve for nearly 5 decades, this decision, arrived at by 5 co-religionists wearing black robes, doesn't reflect the majority view and values of the nation as a whole, and so is apt to bite the Republicans in the ass when America votes in the midterm elections of 2022. If the conservative impulse is to conserve what is deemed to be primal, say the right to life, shouldn't it be applied not only to the unborn still in utero, but as well as to children in classrooms threatened by guns and the future lives of all threatened by global warming? If not, as I think is the case, this is a selective conservatism at its myopic worst. But again, Biden is not to blame. And quite recently, Biden did something he should be praised for, pressing Congress to pass legislative funding for what I began speaking about here. For his CHIPS Plus bill would enable the U.S. to guarantee its own source of semiconductor chips, as well as to become a leading worldwide provider. And small, though significant parts of the Republican Party should be praised for helping to pass the bill. A number of Republican legislators have also attempted to pivot away from Trumpism and return to an earlier, long-held Republican tenet in becoming more hawkish towards Russia. In hindsight, they were also correct to challenge Biden's reluctance to provide Ukraine with more advanced and longer-range weaponry. For clearly, as we've seen, economic sanctions against Russia have not been enough to end the war Putin is waging against Ukraine. And though Biden's reasoning was understandable, like, not wanting to risk further escalation, he wound up placing sanctions on the lethality of the weapons he'd be willing to provide to Ukraine. And so, while America was still allowing 18-year-olds to obtain AR-15 military assault weapons, in Ukraine, David was left to fight Goliath, lacking the best of available slings. Yet a game changer here first made its appearance on June 25th, 2022, 3 days after the publication of Shiva Kumar's paper. It's been mentioned in the news feeds, yet most Americans wouldn't know what I'm alluding to. I'm referring to the day a new weapon system, the HIMARS, H-I-M-A-R-S, appeared on the Ukrainian battlefield. For the presence of HIMARS, high mobility rocket systems, have been both a game changer as well as a needed correction of course to the earlier reluctance of the U.S. to provide Ukraine with longer-range missile systems, the very thing Ukraine had been pleading for since the inception of the war. In recent weeks, the employment of HIMARS enabled Ukraine to begin a counteroffensive that has already liberated 44 villages in the Kherson region previously overtaken by Russia. So, to tell you more about the HIMARS, they are mounted on trucks, which gives them a shoot and scoot capacity. And unlike many of Russia's long-range missiles, they're very precise. Their technology evolved from the war in Iraq, where specific buildings needed to be hit without incurring unwanted, widespread civilian casualty, the very thing that most Russian missiles are unable to avoid, for their weapons are mostly those of saturation, not precision, and will raze entire neighborhoods, many having no specific military value. The HIMARS employ advanced semiconductors combined with an inertial navigation system that enables their rockets to be accurate within 2 or 3 meters, which is pretty damn close for a weapon that then massively explodes. And after firing, the trucks beneath them can scoot away at 60 miles an hour before enemy fire can retaliate. just as significantly, their firepower is long-range. The currently supplied version of the HIMARS, with a range of 50 miles, has pushed the Russians back and partially negated the previous range advantage of Russia's far less accurate missiles. They've been able to hit Russian command centers behind the front lines, decimating the ranks of senior officers, and to knock out bridges the Russians will need to resupply its troops. The counteroffensive made possible by the HIMARS has also stalled the Russian game plan to stage fake elections in occupied territories. The HIMARS can also be used for fighting at night, which the Russian technology has been unable to do, and the Ukrainians have taken advantage of that too. The HIMARS have proven to be so threatening to Russian forces that the Ukrainians have been constructing fake wooden decoys to draw the attention of Russia's Caliber land attack cruise missiles. And this deception has been working brilliantly and in two ways. For Ukrainian Forbes has estimated the cost of each Caliber missile is about $6.5 million. And so the Ukrainian decoys have not only drawn attention away from the real HIMARS, but have been causing Russia to waste millions of dollars on one of Russia's best long-range missiles that take months to produce. In a statement delivered on July 22nd, Lithuanian Foreign Minister Gabrielis Landsbergis said, "The agreement to unblock Odessa would have been impossible without the HIMARS. It's now very clear that the war will end earlier if we arm Ukraine faster." Related assessments of the HIMARS have been made by retired U.S. Army General Mark Hertling, a game changer, as well as by his Australian counterpart, retired Major General Mick Ryan. They've changed the battlefield calculus in the fight for Ukraine, in that they've corroded both Russian capabilities and morale, as had earlier been the case in the battle for Kiev. Poland and the Baltic states have begun ordering hundreds of HIMARS, and a virtue of its technology is that a version employing the same missile platform can be offered that has a 190-mile range. Unlike Ukraine, Poland, Latvia, and Estonia are members of NATO, and likely wouldn't have such a cautious governor placed on the range of the missile system supplied to them. And they've begun talking about acquiring the latest ATACMs, Army Tactical Missiles, for their launchers with a 190-mile range. From the Latvian and Estonian borders, they'd be able to launch strikes well into Russia, while from the Polish and Lithuanian borders, they could strike into Belarus, which has been used by the Russians as a staging area for attacks on Kiev. This would up the price and serve as a deterrent towards Russia attempting elsewhere in the region what it has done in Ukraine. Meanwhile, waiting in the wings, the U.S. military has an even more advanced HIMARS launched rocket, the PRSM, that's Precision Strike Missile, that it plans to bring out in the next year. It has a 300-mile-plus range. If supplied to regional allies, its capability to hit Moscow could provide even greater deterrence to Russian aggression in the region. In retrospect, the counteroffensive just mentioned in the Kherson area was but a feint for its following prong in the area surrounding Kharkiv in mid-September. And the latter, in just 5 days, enabled the Ukrainian forces to retake more territory than the Russians had gained since April. This was a lightning-fast charge that so caught the Russians by surprise that they were forced to flee, leaving behind operable tanks and large stores of ammunition that will now be available to restock Ukrainian forces. This was a successful employment of one of Sun Tzu's proscriptions in his The Art of War, that is, the capacity to use an enemy's weapons against them. It was also the worst defeat of the Russian military since their failed campaign to take Kiev at the beginning of the war. Though the Kremlin has been unwilling to supply statistics of its personnel losses since the first month of the war, military strategist Justin Bronk has reported from the German DW platform that the Russians have now suffered over 48,000 deaths and at least 100,000 casualties. The resultant shortage of infantry has left those still on the battlefield bereft of any time to recoup. They're exhausted, and this has worsened their already existent morale problem, while the morale of the Ukrainians has been not only unwavering, but thus far in the counteroffensive sky high. And quite significantly, for the first time in the war, Putin and his military have begun to take flak at home, though official Russian sources have termed the Russian retreat as merely a strategic regrouping of forces. In truth, the Russians just got their asses kicked, and it may, as some are already saying, be a decisive turning point. Though, more soberly, this war is not yet over, and as Putin himself discovered when still a boy, a cornered rat is far more dangerous. In true to form, following the successful second phase of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, Putin made a rare public appearance. In it, he announced a partial mobilization of 300,000 new troops. These were men who had received some prior military training, and to augment the 200,000 currently left in Ukraine. Plus, he again voiced his nuclear threat as a tit-for-tat response to the increasingly potent weapons now supplied by Ukraine's allies. And he also advocated for independence referendums in Ukraine's Russian-occupied territories. And should these territories declare themselves independent of Ukraine, and thus now part of Russia, barely trained conscripts could be sent there as fodder, in addition to the newly mobilized 300,000. For by Russian law, conscripts can't be sent to foreign territories, and as of this writing, these fake elections have already begun, and they're overseen by armed Russian troops, with the results a manipulated and foregone conclusion. Such sham referendums used to annex territory are also a violation of international law and will confer no validity to Ukraine and her allies. And should the Ukrainians living in these Russian-occupied territories also be conscripted, the morale of the Russian army could only worsen, if not become more subject to sabotage. Though in this buildup of war efforts, there was still ostensibly to be no draft of college students, that is, the war was seeming less remote to Russians as more and more Russian families began to sense their own real skin in Putin's deadly gambit, and sensing a yet more grim trend already visible, thousands of Russians were booking air flights leaving the country. In the week following Putin's September 21st mobilization announcement, there were also dozens of protests in large Russian cities as well as rural areas. They were met by beatings and mass arrests. Military recruitment offices were attacked, with some set ablaze. Video imagery revealed miles-long lines of cars waiting hours to cross borders out of Russia. Into Kazakhstan alone, an estimated 98,000 Russians had fled. More obviously, the war was seeming less and less the special military exercise likely to be completed successfully in a matter of days, and rather than the war trophy to confirm his legacy for posterity, Putin was now carrying more of death's heavy baggage while skating on thinner, ever bloodier ice. For Putin now finds himself in a horrific dilemma. He's a wartime president in a war he started and can't seem to win. Yet his political survival now means that he also can't lose. He'd miscalculated that the war would be won quickly, and even with the application of more draconian measures, it may not be winnable at all. The most recent trajectory has been one in which the tide has shifted in favor of Ukraine, and there's even the real prospect that Ukraine could reclaim the territories lost when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. And so, Putin's mobilization seems a desperate and yet critical marker. But what does it mean now, and what will it mean for Russia going forward? What it means presently is that Putin has just lost something else besides ill-gotten territory. He's lost the national apathy, the national apathy of the Russian people, an apathy he had counted on. For until now, the majority of Russians had mostly been viewing the war as if it was some kind of reality TV show or video game. This had been part of the tacit agreement between Russia's people and her messianic leader, as reflected by Timothy Snyder in his book The Road to Unfreedom: the duty to provide spectacle, the duty to entertain. But the entertainment has become a horror show, a nightmare causing Russia to politically awaken, as well as beginning to become more polarized between its doves and its hawks, not dissimilar to America during the Vietnam War. For now, there are significant parts of the population against the war and protesting in the streets, while others are critical of the ineptitude and lack of determination to do whatever necessary to win the war, with Putin caught in the pincer movement of these two forces as surely as the twin pincers of Ukraine's counteroffensive. On the last day of September, within 24 hours of Putin's declaration that Russia has just annexed the Donetsk region, three significant events occurred. First, there was a grand celebration of the annexation, complete with a pop concert in Moscow's Red Square. Second, Ukrainian forces had encircled 5,000 Russian soldiers in Liman, a strategically important town in Donetsk. Russian troops were left with only three options there: to escape, surrender, or risk being killed. The juxtaposition of these two events was embarrassing for Moscow, though officially portrayed as merely a withdrawal to more advantageous lines, while the Ukrainian defense minister then posted on Twitter a more apt rejoinder to Russia's annexation referendums, one more reflective of the actual conditions on the ground. The Ukrainian army, he posted, has and always will have the decisive vote on today's and any future referendums. The third event was the collective response of the pro-Kremlin hawks, They were now advocating the declaration of martial law in the border regions and the use of low-yield, tactical, nuclear weapons. Putin himself had stated that once the annexations had been formalized, that these territories would be defended with all the military means at Russia's disposal, while Dmitry Medvedev, deputy head of the Russian Security Council, suggested that this could well include nuclear weapons. How to interpret this? Putin's announced mobilization, combined with the threat to use all other available military means, including tactical nuclear weapons, while immediately adding that the latter is not merely a bluff. What Putin seems to be conveying here is that military failure in Ukraine is simply not an option, and that Putin himself now has all of his own skin in the game. He's not hedging his bet, he's doubling down. For to lose the war could threaten Putin's reputation, his hold on Russia, and in the end could even threaten his own life. And to him, nothing could be more important than that. On his own tilted scales, it outweighs all the deaths he has caused and will continue to cause. This is hubris on the worst scale imaginable, and the usual downfall of despots. And to that end, he's now willing to mobilize and risk arming a formerly docile nation. But how will these mobilized feel? How will those mobilized feel about the motivation for the war, and how it's being waged once they arrive on the battlefield? How will their morale compare to the force they'll be facing, who have a righteous cause and who are fighting for their very survival as a people? Plus, it will take time to train these new troops before they even arrive in Ukraine. And so, near term, it is likely that Ukrainian forces will continue to run the table. And once the newly arrived appear on the battlefield, will they be the triumphant patriots coming to the aid of the motherland, or the reluctant scrubs serving as fodder for the already demoralized varsity? And if the finally increased numbers on the battlefield are not enough to turn the tide in favor of his army, Putin likely would be willing to use limited-yield nuclear weapons. And here, for once, Russia's psychopathic leader may actually be truthful. It's not a bluff. And if there's any comfort to be found in the above assessment, it's just that nuclear weapons are unlikely to be used in the next short-term stage of this war, which is no guarantee going forward. And if there is a deus ex machina ending waiting in the wings here, it hasn't appeared yet, for Putin is all in, and Russia and Ukraine has nowhere else to go. And going forward, the prospects for Russia seem grim. As reflected by Michael Kimmage and Maria Lipman in an article published on September 27 in Foreign Affairs, Putin, according to the article, has every resource he needs to transform Russia into a brutal police state, far more repressive than it is at the present moment. That will win him no sincere support for the war, and it may give him no new advantage in the war, but it will grant him a means of corralling Russians into the war effort and severely punishing anyone who stands in his way. In prosecuting his war in Ukraine, Putin will be relentless. In prosecuting his war at home, he will be ruthless. That's what they said in the article. So this promises to be a long, ugly, and jarring spectacle for Russia, Putin, and the world at large. A spectacle of the worst sort, one that we'll be watching from the edge of our seats. China, meanwhile, has been intently watching the ongoing results of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for it has served as a low-cost trial balloon for a similar invasion that China has been long threatening to launch against Taiwan. Yet much of the world has grown as dependent on Taiwan for advanced semiconductor chips as it had become dependent on Russia for its petroleum exports. And for years now, China has not been successful in manufacturing the more advanced chips. Success here is now part of a new Chinese 5-year plan. But planning for something is not the same as doing it. They still don't have the innovative know-how, plus China's commitment to state funding the R&D of its many manufacturers has actually lessened the support of its more innovative companies. And so China still seems years away from producing the kind of semiconductors that are increasingly needed for state-of-the-art weaponry, the kind of weaponry that painfully slowly Ukraine has begun to receive from the U.S. and her allies. And this reluctant slowness had resulted in 1/5 of Ukraine being occupied by Russia, with the currency there converted to the Russian ruble and media broadcasts converted to Russian state-sponsored TV. But as Russia runs out of semiconductor chips, it'll be left as bereft as the EU running out of natural gas. So, if the war in Ukraine has been termed a war of attrition, the most decisive attritions may play out between semiconductor chips and natural gas. This will be a battle of wills, and who blinks first. And the collective will of the Ukrainians is so unified against Putin that it hasn't come close to blinking. In the meantime, largely lacking advanced semiconductors and the precise strike capabilities they offer, much, but not all, of Russian warfare will remain primitive and indiscriminate in its violence against civilian populations and in ways that have violated the Geneva Conventions. So it's not just that Putin is psychopathic in being willing to employ this approach to warfare. For all his seeming self-assurance and his self-absorbed vacant stare into space, Putin's lack of semiconductors has left him now with little in the way of escalating alternatives in his own mind, short of going nuclear. Short of that, the only alternative left to him is to prolong the war as long as he can, in the hope that Ukraine's allies will lose their resolve in supporting Ukraine. And though he blames NATO for his recent losses, while failing to acknowledge the resiliency, skill, and will of Ukraine's unified forces, Putin finds himself trapped in a maze he devised himself. Back to China. Its future ability to catch up technologically with the U.S. depends on continued access to Taiwanese chips. For currently, China receives more than 90% of its high-tech semiconductor chips and a large portion of its low-level chips from Taiwan. And this is likely why, after Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, China only applied economic sanctions against Taiwan's agricultural exports. Thus far, the Taiwanese expertise at chip production, combined with the Chinese need for it, has supplied Taiwan with a kind of semiconductor shield against the kind of invasion suffered by Ukraine. This fact could provide a different, less threatening light in which to read the saber-rattling show of strength made by China's military exercises in and over the Taiwan Strait after Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in early August. That, in turn, was followed by a similar show of strength in the same waters by the U.S. guided missile cruisers Antietam and Chancellorsville later that month. For both sides need to strike a balance earlier alluded to between having a moderate enough foreign policy that provides the basic trust that encourages trade agreements, while projecting the military power that will protect against the loss of these trade ties, while demonstrating as well the strength to protect regional allies. While no one possesses an omniscient crystal ball, a perspective offered by Copeland is actually encouraging. He writes, by reassuring Beijing that China will continue to receive semiconductors from Taiwan, even if not the sophisticated machines from the Netherlands needed to make them, the Biden administration can moderate Beijing's concerns about future trade and reduce the likelihood of crisis and war. While the alternative, attacking Taiwan, might destroy everything that the Chinese Communist Party has achieved over the past 4 decades. And it could include the possible destruction of Taiwan's chip manufacturing facilities. And besides, a moribund economy plus the lingering COVID pandemic has left already enough on Xi Jinping's plate as he faces the upcoming Communist Party Congress, where he hopes to secure his third, if not a lifelong term. Whereas refraining from an attack upon Taiwan while maintaining existing trade ties will help build China's power base and continue to increase the wealth of the average citizen, and both are necessary for the Chinese president to maintain his own power and the continuing support of one-party rule in China. Also, somewhat encouraging is that China's vow to support Russia hasn't vouchsafed Russia from its dwindling supply of advanced semiconductor chips. For China either can't or hasn't yet risked providing to Russia what it hasn't yet learned how to produce for itself. So China's support of Russia has seemed less than full-hearted. Yet Putin remains a nuclear-toothed rat, the dangerous, hubristic joker in this house of cards. As the world holds its breath while watching the war unfolding in Ukraine, the emergence of HIMARS on the battlefield is also encouraging, for it has greatly aided Ukraine's counteroffensive as missiles launched from trucks make Ukrainian forces faster and more nimble than the Russians. The availability of HIMARS also gives allies in the region a form of tactical deterrence once offered by nuclear weapons, yet without their potentially catastrophic outcome that till now has made them strategically unthinkable, except by the truly deranged should they become more desperate. For the moment at least, let's step back and attempt a historical overview from, from 30,000 feet. And in particular to the saying, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeating it. From this more pristine, elevated, and objective vantage, it might be more evident than it's been that the wide-scale suffering that has been a constant in world history has not and cannot be resolved by political or military means alone. Further, that without individual transformation, the attempt at social or political transformation is apt to be impaired. This is why so many social reform movements and the political parties they gave rise to have simply replaced one gang of thugs for another. History provides ample and ongoing examples of tyrannical leaders emerging from social movements ostensibly intended to relieve social suffering. And whether it's been called the three poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance by Buddhists, or the nafs by Sufism, these destructive impulses in humanity are all the more destructive when infecting a ruler who can create even more destructive suffering, for then the greed, anger, and ignorance becomes institutionalized, impacting a culture, if not the world at large. In a marvelous essay that David Loy published in the spring 2009 issue of Tricycle, he writes, "The Greek experiment with democracy failed for the same reason that our modern experiment with democracy is in danger of failing. It is the reason I mentioned earlier. Unless social reconstruction is accompanied by personal transformation, democracy merely liberates the ego self. If I'm still motivated by greed, ill will, and delusion, my freedom will be dangerous to myself as well as to others. As long as the illusion of an individual self separate from all others remains strong, democracy, despite the countless attempts that have been made to create systemic safeguards, can't help but provide opportunities for some individuals to take advantage of others." Regarding the Greek experiment of democracy, Loy goes on to write something as true for us now in America as it was for the ancient Greeks. He writes, "It soon became obvious that private appetites were motivating people to corrupt the democratic process. Demosthenes lamented that politics had become the path to riches, for individuals no longer placed the state before themselves, but viewed it as another way to promote their own personal advantage. Plato's distaste for democracy is explicit in the Republic, where he argues that too much liberty encourages a lack of self-restraint that tends to yield to the strongest pressures of the moment, a recipe for social as well as psychological strife." Loy ends his essay by pointing out that Western attempts at social reconstruction have had limited success because they've been compromised by ego-driven individual motivations, while Buddhism, and by extension other spiritual platforms, have also had limited success in reducing the amount of suffering in the world. Each has been limited because it lacked the other. Their convergence in our time, he writes, opens up fresh possibilities. Each might find in the other the perspective it needs to realize its own deepest promise. To restate this, the fresh possibility in our times may be where those engaged in social reconstruction or political activism become wedded and informed by those engaged in spiritual practice, and vice versa. In scripting these videos, I've found myself shifting the visionary and narrative focus between looking backwards and looking forwards. And it's suddenly called to mind the Roman god Janus, a god turned to at times of transition. For Janus provided the perspective then called for, as one of his heads faced the past and the other the future. Janus presided over the beginning and ending of conflict, and hence war and peace. And we seem now at a time of profound transition. And so, when we look forward, the world continues to face the looming possibility for other catastrophic outcomes that are not only possible, but increasingly likely, and thus we should think about them more. For, as should already be evident, global warming threatens us all, as do pandemics, including those likely to come as climate change leaves less of our planet livable by humans, who then encroach further upon wild animal populations that spawn the pandemics. And the loss of livable human landscapes may well give rise to increased territorial disputes between nations, each vying for their own survival, if not dominance, in a landscape of dwindling resources. A prime example is China, which for years now has been facing an increasing water shortage. As earlier as 2005, Premier Wen Jiabao stated that water scarcity threatened the very survival of the Chinese nation. For China possesses 20% of the world's population, yet only 7% of its fresh water. Many of its rivers have disappeared entirely, while industrialization and pollution have spoiled much of the water that remains. By some estimates, 80 to 90% of China's groundwater and half of its river water is too dirty to drink. More than half of its groundwater and 1/4 of its river water can't even be used for industry or farming. And China's water shortage has already been causing geopolitical strife. As Hal Brands reflects the above in an opinion piece published by Bloomberg, much of China's fresh water is sourced from Himalayan areas such as Tibet, which had been seized by the communist government by force after taking power in 1949. Such acts of hubris, as previously suggested, can give rise to unintended consequences, and the Chinese antipathy towards Tibet further cemented the spiritual impoverishment of China's communist government, while the resulting diaspora of Tibetan spiritual teachers and teachings then spread to the West. But back to water. For years, China has tried to solve its resource challenges by impoverishing its neighbors. Currently, that's showing itself in the Himalayas as China plans to dam key waters before they reach India, leaving India bereft. Similarly, by building a series of giant dams on the Mekong River, Beijing has triggered reoccurring droughts and devastating floods in Southeast Asian countries such as Thailand and Laos that are dependent on that waterway, while the diversions of rivers in Xinjiang has had a devastating downstream impact in Central Asia. After reflecting the above, Brands quotes the Indian strategic analyst Brahma Chalani. He says, China's territorial aggrandizement in the South China Sea and the Himalayas has been accompanied by stealthier efforts to appropriate water resources in transnational river basins. In other words, writes Brands, the thirstier China is, the more geopolitically nasty it could get. Such territorial disputes also remain more likely due to the worldwide spread of autocracies, which in themselves are more subject to entitled, narcissistic, and psychopathic leadership, with Putin and Trump being cases in point, though hopefully not remaining successful models for those yet to come. For should such leaders maintain their power base, let alone increase in their numbers, we be witnessing the further and grave loss of the developmental achievements ushered in by the 18th century's Age of Reason that gave rise to Western democracies, their rule of law, and the fact-based sciences that would prove capable of putting men on the moon. Already, the lies of autocratic leaders and their propaganda channels leave their nations less able to recognize, let alone agree, about facts themselves. There is an evolutionary question to the above that few are asking and no one can answer yet. Will we as a species evolve fast enough and collectively mobilize enough political will to successfully meet these catastrophic outcomes before it's too late? These questions of will and its several varieties are treated in my new book on trusting in God and tethering your camel in a world falling apart at the seams, to be published, God willing, in 2023. For what makes our epic different from any others is neither the polarizing nature of ethnocentric warfare, nor the employment of game-changing weaponry. These elements have been a constant for millennia, while the background stakes are higher now, and they've brought us to a crucial evolutionary inflection point. For what's truly distinctive about our time is that we no longer have the lazy ease of generations and centuries to evolve farther and faster than we have. Collectively, we're in a time of great urgency, yet the response has not been urgent enough. For much of our world remains developmentally stunted at an egocentric perspective where it's all about me, or the only slightly more developed perspective where it's all about the supremacy of my tribal group, my political party. And there are fragments in every culture whose perspective is more objective, less divisive. While bringing up the rear, there's a numerically tiny population who punch way above their numerical ranking, those who possess no conscience and have no moral restraints at all. They are fundamentally lawless and could care less about other people or the damaging crimes they commit, for they are incapable of feeling empathy, guilt, or remorse. They don't learn from experience, and why their recidivism rates is so high in prisons. They are ethically numbed, as if the outcome of a moral root canal. To the untrained eye, they can appear quite normal, but in truth, they are con men wearing a mask that hides something not fully human. Lying and blaming others for what they themselves do are central elements in their talking style. They are called psychopaths, and when they ascend to political leadership, the results can be grim for us all. Each of these forms of developmental arrest create headwinds to a culture's mental health and evolutionary advancement. An advancement that, when it proceeds, results in increasing levels of empathic inclusivity, while the more developmentally stymied remain inherently divisive and both polarized and polarizing. And they impede the adaptivity and cooperation now urgently needed. When Gurdjieff was once asked by a student what would be required to increase the rate of our development, he succinctly replied, "Increased necessity." While the great Swiss psychiatrist C.G. Jung said something remarkably similar. Without necessity, nothing budges. The human personality least of all. It is tremendously conservative, not to say torpid. Only acute necessity is able to arouse it. What remains to be seen is whether an increased necessity becomes an adequate mother of invention, and whether the urgencies we're facing give rise to a rapid uptick in a more objective and adaptive awareness. If not, what our children and grandchildren inherit from us will be an increasingly dystopian world. For as David Attenborough, the eminent biologist and natural historian, has told us, the sixth mass extinction event is well underway. To which I would add, and neither time nor God are on our side. At present, America remains divided and in a struggle just to preserve its own democracy, where the near-term, mid-term election tea leaves remain uncertain, while the autocracies in Russia and China remain still capable of threatening the larger world with their shared sense of grievances from the past, the sense of hubristic entitlement, and its rationalized justifications for aggression. And it will be interesting, to say the least, how all this plays out. In fact, those of us alive now and witnessing what comes next may already be living under the haunting spell of an unrecognized Buddhist curse. May you be reborn in an interesting time.